But I think one day women are going to be very angry at the fact that they were not given all the information. There's many organizations now that are opening up, women coming forward and speaking about their personal abortion story. And a lot of it is anger that they weren't given the whole truth when they made that decision as a teenager.
It's just really ridiculous, the lies that women are told when they go into these centers and the lack of professional counseling. The quality of care is so outside the realm of normative medicine.
I had more information given to me about my wisdom tooth taken out.
You know, you get more information when you get your appendix removed than you do from having an abortion.
And like I said, I was really confused. He just wasn't talking to me about things.
Nobody wants to talk about it. It's a very difficult topic for everyone. And physicians are busy and push for time, and they don't really want to talk about it.
And the decision has to be informed, which means that there's a whole range of information that the doctor has to give the patient, both about the treatment or the intervention that they're thinking of having, all of its alternatives, and the alternative of doing nothing, plus all of the benefits, potential benefits, risks and harms of all of the possibilities.
It appears that women are being asked to make a lifelong decision under time pressure, peer pressure, parental pressure, and without sufficient information. That's a lot to demand from anybody, especially a frightened teenager.
On my way out the door of the doctor's office, I saw a poster on the wall of the development, of a child. And when I went to step in to look at that, he actually stepped in front of me and said, "You don't want to look at that. That's just going to make your decision harder." And that was what I left with. That's basically all the information that I had before I left to make my decision.
I said, "What is abortion like?" And he said, "Well, it's just like pulling a tooth out." Well, I've had a few teeth pulled out in my life and a little bit of pain, and after that it goes away. I never connected that I was pregnant with a baby. And most women don't who have abortions.
I was lied to and I was deceived. The second time I found out that I was pregnant, I asked the doctor what was developed, like what's really there. And he took a pen and a piece of paper and he put a dot in the page and he says, "Oh, it's nothing, it's just a clump of tissue." Mm-hmm. So I thought, oh, well, it must be okay if the doctor thinks it's okay and the government thinks it's okay and my mother thought it was okay. I thought it must be all right. And then years later, when I was reading a book on pregnancy and childbirth, and I saw the truth about fetal development, it was devastating.
So for example, if let's say that there was no mention of risk of infertility to a woman having an abortion, and in fact the abortion did cause her to become infertile, then she would be able to sue for damages for that, because she wouldn't have given her fully informed consent to having that abortion when she didn't know of that risk. Because come back to the test, would that be a risk that would be material to the reasonable woman in the same circumstances? And clearly the answer would be yes. That would be a very important risk to know about.
What it really says is that if you have an increased risk of any procedure that's even very, very low, that in my state in particular, in the United States in particular as well, it's mostly the reasonable person or reasonable patient would like to know. So if I told you I was going to do a procedure on you and there was even a remote risk that there might be a risk for possible infertility for instance, my world, or for preterm delivery, or for breast cancer, or any of those things, I should inform you of that.
But the fact is, certainly as far as induced abortion is concerned, as we said before, I don't think these women have any kind of informed consent. And of course that's because obstetricians or people doing it don't believe the literature that we've reviewed.
So a lot of times when there's criticism, the person blogging or writing the critique hasn't even read the study.
Well, most of the time the criticism, one, there's either the conspiracy of silence, as I tell people. I said, so when I quote there's 139 or 140 articles showing that preterm birth is increased with abortion, they just ignore me. They won't answer or respond. Then
the doctor's got a legal obligation and also an ethical obligation to disclose that information to the patient before they make their decision. So as we get new information, whether it's about abortion or a cancer treatment or cosmetic surgery or whatever it is, that has to be disclosed. Otherwise, the patient's decision whether to have or not have the treatment is not an informed decision, which means it's legally invalid, which means that that's an instance of medical malpractice on the part of the doctor, because the doctor is guilty of malpractice if they don't get a proper informed consent.
Prior to undergoing her procedure, she is asked to sign a consent form. Now, a document that intends to inform is written in understandable language. It's a typical medical consent form written so that a teenager under extreme pressure can understand it? Or is it written in legalese, designed to put the patient in a fog while protecting the medical community?
The other problem with written consent is that sometimes what doctors do is simply hand over the form and say, read this. And two things. First of all, there have been lots of studies done on the language that's used in consent forms, and it's really impenetrable. I mean, there's a scale called a fog index of how difficult something is to read and understand. And True Romance is written at a fog index of 4.
So that is what a consent form should be written at. Instead, they are written at a level 23. Even worse than legalese.
Time magazine is written at a fog index of 12, which is considered reasonably comprehensible by somebody who's graduated from high school. Legal contracts are written at a fog index of about 22, and the consent forms that were looked at in this study were at a fog index of 23. So consent forms are not in themselves the answer.
The courts say that the doctors must ensure the patient's full comprehension of the risks, not just have them sign something.
And also, if you look at the medical malpractice cases where there's been a finding of a failure to obtain informed consent, in one of them, for example, there was a signed consent form that had every possible risk explained in it, and the court looked at it and said, well, there's a signed consent form. Fine, we're aware of that. Now let's see if they really did get informed consent. So signing a consent form is not the giving of informed consent.
I was confused. I didn't have any education as far as what my choices were.
So if a reasonable patient would want to know about that, the doctor's got a legal obligation to disclose it. Plus, the doctor has to fully, openly and honestly answer any questions that the patient asks. So you can't just pat the patient on the head and say, don't you worry about it, everything will be all right. If you do that, and in actual fact you should have told them something else, then you haven't got an informed consent, and then you're going to be liable, medical malpractice liability, for failing to get an informed consent.
It's disingenuous to just say this procedure will happen and everything's going to be fine, because that's simply not true. No procedure is like that, and no procedure is without risk. If I did a delivery of a baby by cesarean, I would explain what was going to happen. I wouldn't just say we're just going to take your baby out and leave it at that.
I was patronized, it's okay, dear. It's so, it's no big deal.
And I said, they needed to give you a consent to sign. Did you sign a consent form saying that you consented to having your abortion? She said, yes. And I said, well, attached to that should have been a list of problems that you could have got into. Did you read it? She said, sure, I read it, but I didn't understand any of it. And then I said, well, and she said, well, I asked the nurse what all those words meant, because I didn't even know how to pronounce half of them. And she said that I didn't need to know what the problems were after abortions. Abortions were simply a benign procedure, and I was here to have an abortion because I didn't want my baby, and that's right, so let's get on with it.
I was never informed about the truth about fetal development. I was never informed about all the risk factors of abortion, that abortion could cause depression, that abortion could do all this damage in my uterus and cervix. I was never told the truth.
People who have had abortions 10 years ago and people who've had abortions 2 years ago or even a year ago still say they weren't educated. There's not enough information that's been given to them to have properly made their decision.